The words sliced through me raw and biting as a winter wind ripping through a frayed shawl. "Go to your room, Grandma." My grandson sneered, his 16-year-old voice dripping with a venom I never thought a boy could carry. I stood frozen in my own kitchen, my hands quivering around a worn mug of chamomile tea, its faint steam curling upward like the last wisps of my self-respect. The silence that followed wasn't soft or kind. It was heavy, suffocating, daring me to shatter beneath its weight. My son David sat at the dining table, his eyes locked on his phone, his face as blank as a winter sky, offering no whisper of defense. My daughter-in-law, Karen, leaned against the counter, her lips twitching into a thin, mocking smile, one that pretended to shrug. Oh, kids, but her eyes gleamed with something colder, something that savored my humiliation. At 68, widowed for 10 long years, I wasn't Lily anymore, not the woman who'd soothed a son through fevers, buried a husband with quiet grace, or woven this family together through decades of storms. I was just an old woman ordered to disappear in the home I'd built with every heartbeat. How do you describe the ache of being erased in the place where your life story is etched? Maybe you've known it, that slow, crushing realization that the people you've loved most, sacrificed for most, no longer see you as human. They don't see the mother, the widow, the woman who once commanded respect. They see a shadow, a burden to be pushed aside. My name is Lillian Wilson, and for 43 years this house has been my haven. It's a weary 2-story colonial, its floors creaking with memories, its front porch sagging under the weight of too many summers. My husband Tom and I bought it when we were 25, our pockets nearly empty, but our hearts brimming with dreams. We raised David here, patched the roof through howling hurricanes, and carved our initials into the oak tree in the backyard, a quiet vow to each other. When Tom passed, I thought I'd already endured the deepest pain life could offer. I was mistaken. 5 years ago, David and Karen came to live with me. David had lost his job and their savings had dwindled to nothing. Without a second thought, I opened my doors. "Come home," I said, my arms wide, imagining the warmth of family filling these walls again. Nights of laughter, the clatter of board games, the rich scent of my meatloaf drifting through the house. But that dream faded quickly. I became a ghost, haunting my own life. Karen took over repainting the soft yellow walls Tom and I had chosen, covering them with stark whites and grays that felt like they belonged to a stranger. David stopped calling me Mom, addressing me instead as Lily, as if I were a tenant, renting a corner of their world. And Ethan, my grandson, who once curled up in my lap begging for bedtime stories, grew into a sullen teenager who flinched at my voice, his eyes rolling with impatience whenever I spoke. I told myself it was just time passing the natural drift of generations. But that night in the kitchen, when Ethan's words cut me like a blade, and no one, not David, not Karen, lifted a finger to stop it, I knew it wasn't time. It was betrayal. I didn't cry, though the urge burned in my throat. My tears had long since dried, spent on harder losses. Tom's illness, the lonely nights that followed the slow unraveling of the family I'd fought to hold together. Instead, I set the mug down the porcelain, clinking softly against the counter, a deliberate sound in the heavy quiet. I turned and climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last, my knees aching my heart. Heavier still. My room, once the master bedroom where Tom and I had whispered dreams in the dark, was now a cramped guest room at the end of the hall. Karen had claimed the master suite without asking, relegating me to this small space with a narrow bed, a wobbly nightstand, and a single window overlooking the backyard. I sank onto the edge of the mattress, my hands folded tightly in my lap, and stared at the scuffed hardwood floor. These boards had carried my weight through countless nights pacing with David, when he was feverish, tiptoeing past his room, when he was a teenager praying for strength, when Tom's hospital bills piled up. Now I was banished here like a child sent to bed without supper in the house I'd paid for, loved for, lived for. How long I sat there, I couldn't say. The house grew dark, the evening sounds fading into a hush. Eventually, I rose my joints stiff and shuffled to the window. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, gazing out at the oak tree, its branches swaying in the moonlight like they were whispering secrets. Tom used to call that tree our witness. It had seen our joys' picnics in the yard, David's first wobbly bike ride. It had seen our sorrows' arguments that spilled into the night, the ambulance that carried Tom away for the last time. What did it see now? An old woman fading into the margins of her own story, or someone who still had something left to say, something left to prove. Morning came with the sharp edge of Karen's voice barking at Ethan to hurry for school. I stayed in my room waiting for the house to empty, unwilling to face their indifference so soon. When the front door slammed and silence settled, I crept downstairs, my slippers whispering against the stairs. The kitchen felt foreign, no longer mine. Karen had replaced my trusty percolator with a sleek coffee machine, all buttons and lights incomprehensible to me. I stood there staring at it, feeling foolish out of place in the space where I'd once baked birthday cakes and brewed coffee for Tom's early shifts. Then I saw it, a note on the counter. Karen's handwriting, jagged and impatient. "Lily, please don't touch the new appliances. We'll handle dinner." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a boundary drawn in black ink to keep me out. My throat tightened, a tangle of anger and grief choking me. I bypassed the coffee machine and filled a glass with water from the sink, the cold liquid doing little to ease the fire in my chest. Carrying the glass, I stepped onto the front porch and settled into the old rocking chair where Tom and I used to sit watching the world unfold. The neighborhood was stirring children, pedaling bikes, dogs yapping, the steady hum of life marching forward. I'd once been part of that hum back when I was Mrs. Wilson, the school secretary, who organized fundraisers, chaperoned field trips, and earned smiles from parents and teachers alike. Now I was just Lily, the old woman who cluttered up the house. I sipped the water, letting its chill sink into me, and replayed the previous night in my mind. Ethan's cruel words, David's silence, Karen's smirk, they looped like a song I couldn't escape. And that note sitting on the counter like a verdict. But another thought pushed through, quiet but persistent, the deed to this house, locked away in a safe deposit box at the bank, bearing my name alone. They didn't know. They assumed the house was theirs, that I was merely a guest they grudgingly tolerated. But it was mine, every shingle, every beam, every memory etched into its walls. Tom and I had scraped together every penny for it, painted it, repaired it, loved it. It was my legacy, my proof of a life well lived. As I rocked in that chair, the oak tree standing sentinel in the yard, I felt something stir inside me. Not loud, not angry, but steady like a river carving its path through stone. I didn't know what I would do, not yet. But I knew I was done going to my room, not for Ethan, not for Karen, not for anyone. I'd spent my life building this home, this family, and I'd be damned if I let them bury me in it. I stood my knees protesting, but my spine straight, and walked back inside. The kitchen was still quiet, the note still lying there like a challenge. I picked it up, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my pocket. It was a small act, but it felt like the first step toward something bigger, something I couldn't yet see. The days that followed felt like walking through fog, each step heavy with a loneliness I hadn't known since Tom's passing. Ethan's words, "Go to your room," Grandma, echoed in my mind, a cruel refrain that played whenever the house fell quiet. I moved through my routines like a shadow, careful not to disturb the life David and Karen had built within my walls. I'd wake early before the sun breached the horizon and tiptoe downstairs to boil water in an old kettle I'd hidden in the pantry, unwilling to touch Karen's gleaming coffee machine. I'd sit on the porch with my tea, watching the neighborhood stir, and try to convince myself that this was still my home. but the truth was undeniable. I was a stranger here, tolerated, but not wanted my presence a footnote in their story. Karen's note stayed in my pocket, its sharp edges pressing against my thigh, a constant reminder of my place. I didn't confront her about it, nor did I challenge David's silence or Ethan's cruelty. What would I say? That I deserved better. That this house, with its creaky floors and sagging porch, was mine. They wouldn't listen. They'd stopped seeing me long before that night in the kitchen. Instead, I shrank into myself, keeping to my small room at the end of the hall, emerging only when I was sure they were gone. I'd dust the shelves, water the plants, or fold laundry tasks that once felt like love but now seemed like penance. The oak tree out back watched me through the window, its branches swaying as if in sympathy, but even that felt distant, like a memory of a life I no longer lived. I stopped joining them for dinner. It wasn't a decision I announced, just a quiet withdrawal. The first night I stayed upstairs claiming a headache. Karen didn't question it. David didn't notice. Ethan sprawled on the couch, with his headphones, didn't even glance my way. By the third night, my absence was unremarkable, as if I'd never sat at that table at all. I'd heat a can of soup in the microwave when they were asleep, eating alone at the kitchen counter, the hum of the refrigerator, my only company. The solitude was a weight, but it was safer than their indifference. I told myself I was protecting my heart, but deep down I knew I was hiding from the truth that the family I'd built had no room for me. Yet even in that fog, there were moments when the world reached out like a hand extended through the mist. One morning, as I sat on the porch, my tea gone cold, a familiar figure appeared at the end of the street. It was Clara, my old friend from my days as a school secretary. She was 70 now, her hair a soft silver, her walk slower but still purposeful. We hadn't spoken in months, not since Karen had started discouraging visitors, claiming the house was too chaotic for company. Clara didn't call ahead. She just showed up, her arms full of a potted geranium, her smile as warm as ever. "Lillian Wilson," she said, climbing the porch steps, "you've been hiding from me long enough." Her voice was teasing, but her eyes searched mine, seeing more than I wanted her to. I forced a smile, gesturing to the rocking chair beside me, but my hands shook as I set my mug down. Clara didn't waste time with small talk. She placed the geranium on the porch rail and sat her gaze steady. "You look like you're carrying the world, Lily. What's going on in this house?" I wanted to lie, to say everything was fine, but the weight of her kindness cracked something open inside me. I told her about Ethan's words, David's silence, Karen's note, each confession spilling out like water from a broken dam. I told her how I felt like a ghost, how the house I'd loved for 43 years felt like a prison. Clara listened, her face soft but her eyes fierce, and when I finished, she reached for my hand. Her skin was warm, her grip firm, and for the first time in weeks, I felt anchored. "You're not invisible, Lily," she said, her voice low but steady. "Not to me, not to the people who matter. You've spent your life giving. Don't let them take what's yours." She squeezed my hand, then stood brushing her skirt. "This geranium's for you. Plant it somewhere they can't touch. A piece of beauty that's yours alone." I watched her walk away, the geranium's red petals glowing in the morning light. Her words stayed with me like a seed planted in barren soil. That afternoon, I carried the pot to the backyard near the oak tree and knelt in the dirt. My knees ached, but I dug a small hole with a trowel, my hands caked in earth. As I pressed the geranium into the ground, I felt a flicker of something, defiance maybe, or hope. This was my yard, my tree, my home. Karen could paint the walls, David could ignore me, Ethan could mock me, but they couldn't take this moment, this small act of claiming something for myself. The next day, I woke with a purpose I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't grand or loud, just a quiet resolve to stop shrinking. I started small, reclaiming pieces of my routine. Instead of hiding in my room, I began sitting in the living room during the day, reading books I'd loved in my youth, Jane Austen, Toni Morrison books that reminded me of the woman I'd been before I let myself fade. Karen noticed her eyes narrowing when she saw me on the couch, but I didn't move. I met her gaze. My expression calm, and after a moment she turned away. It was a tiny victory, but it felt like breathing again. I also started walking to the local library a mile from the house. The exercise was hard on my joints, but the rhythm of my steps, the feel of the sun on my face, made me feel alive. The librarians knew me from my school days, and they greeted me with smiles, asking about my reading offering to order books they thought I'd like. One afternoon, a young librarian named Sarah handed me a copy of The Secret Garden. This one's about finding life in forgotten places. She said her eyes kind. I took the book home and read it in my room, the story of Mary and Colin stirring memories of my own childhood when I'd believed anything could grow with enough care. These small acts, planting the geranium, reading in the living room, walking to the library, were like stitches in a torn fabric, mending pieces of myself I'd thought lost. I began to notice things I'd ignored, the way the oak tree's shadow danced on my bedroom wall at dusk, the smell of rain on the porch, the sound of my own laughter when I read something funny. I wasn't whole, not yet, but I was starting to remember who I was. Lily Ann Wilson, who'd organized bake sales, danced with Tom under the stars, and raised a son with love even when it hurt. That woman wasn't gone, no matter how hard they tried to erase her. One evening, as I sat on the porch, the geranium blooming brightly beside me, I pulled Karen's note from my pocket. I unfolded it, tracing the sharp lines of her handwriting. It was just a piece of paper, but it had felt like a chain. I thought about Clara's words about not letting them take what was mine. The house, the deed, the life I'd built, they were still mine, even if David and Karen acted otherwise. I didn't know what I'd do with that knowledge, not yet, but it was a spark glowing faintly in the dark. I folded the note again and tucked it away, my gaze drifting to the oak tree. Its branches swayed steady and strong, as if nodding in agreement. I wasn't ready to fight, not in the way the world might expect, with shouts or ultimatums. But I was ready to stand, to take up space, to stop apologizing for existing. And as the stars began to prick the evening sky, I felt a quiet strength settle in my bones, like the roots of that geranium reaching deep into the earth. The fog of loneliness didn't lift entirely, but it thinned enough for me to see glimmers of myself through the haze. Ethan's words, "Go to your room." Grandma still haunted me, a wound that throbbed whenever I passed the kitchen where he'd mocked me. Yet the small acts I'd begun planting, Clara's geranium, reading in the living room, walking to the library, had kindled a spark within me, faint but stubborn, like a candle, refusing to gutter in a storm. I was Lily Ann Wilson, not the shadow they'd made me feel like, and I clung to that truth as I navigated the house that no longer felt like home. Each day I moved with a quiet defiance, careful but deliberate reclaiming corners of my life they'd tried to take. Mornings became my sanctuary. I'd rise before dawn when the house was still wrapped in sleep and slip downstairs to brew tea with my hidden kettle. The soft whistle of boiling water felt like a secret shared between me and the silence. I'd carry my mug to the porch, settling into the rocking chair where Tom and I had spent countless evenings, and watch the world wake. The neighborhood hummed with early risers, joggers, dog walkers, the paper boy on his bike, and their rhythm reminded me that life went on even for me. I'd sip my tea, the warmth seeping into my hands, and let myself remember. Not just the pain of Ethan's cruelty or David's silence, but the years before, when I was Mrs. Wilson, the school secretary, who could organize a fundraiser in a day when Tom's laughter filled this porch, when David still called me Mom with love in his voice. Inside the house, though, I was still a ghost. Karen's presence dominated her sharp voice, cutting through the air as she directed Ethan's mornings, or planned dinners I was no longer invited to. David drifted through his eyes, avoiding mine, his conversations with me reduced to grunts or curt nods. Ethan, when he wasn't glued to his phone, treated me like furniture, something to step around, not acknowledge. I'd stopped expecting warmth from them, but the coldness still stung, a daily reminder of how far I'd fallen in their eyes. Karen's note, still tucked in my pocket, had become a talisman of sorts, not of defeat, but of resolve. Every time I touched it, I felt the weight of their dismissal, but also the truth they didn't know this house, every inch of it, was mine. I leaned into my small rebellions. I kept reading in the living room, my books a shield against Karen's disapproving glances. One afternoon, she walked in, her arms crossed, and said, "Lily, don't you think the couch is a bit crowded with all these books?" Her tone was polite, but her eyes were hard a challenge. I looked up from the secret garden, my finger marking the page, and smiled, not warmly, but steadily. "I've always read here," I said, my voice calm but firm. "It's my home, after all." Her lips tightened, but she didn't push. She turned and left her heels clicking on the hardwood, and I felt a rush of triumph, small but real. I wasn't invisible, not anymore. My walks to the library grew longer, more purposeful. The mile there and back was hard on my knees, but the ache was worth it. The library was a refuge, its quiet aisles filled with the scent of old paper and possibility. Sarah, the young librarian, became an unexpected ally. She'd save books for me, slipping them across the counter with a smile. One day, she handed me A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. "This one's about claiming your space." She said, her eyes bright. "I thought of you." I took the book, my throat tight, and murmured a thank you. At home, I read it slowly, Woolf's words sinking into me like rain into parched earth. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. I wasn't a writer, but I understood. I needed a space, a life that was mine, not borrowed, not tolerated, but owned. Clara's visits became a lifeline. She'd stop by unannounced always with something, a loaf of her homemade sourdough, a jar of peach jam, once a tiny watercolor painting of a sunflower. "For your room," she said, handing me the painting. "A little brightness for you." I hung it above my nightstand, its yellow petals glowing against the drab wall. Clara never stayed long, but her presence was a balm. Her stories of her own life, widowed like me, but fiercely independent, reminding me that I wasn't alone. One morning, as we sat on the porch, she told me about a trip she'd taken to the coast, just her, and a suitcase, no plans. "You should go somewhere, Lily," she said, her eyes searching mine. "Not forever, but just to remember you're more than this house." I laughed, brushing it off, but her words lingered, a seed I wasn't ready to plant. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since my school days. Not stories, but letters to Tom, to the Lily I used to be, to the family I'd lost. I wrote them in a notebook I kept under my pillow, pouring out my grief, my anger, my hopes. "Dear Tom, I wrote one night, I miss you. I miss us. I don't know how to be strong without you, but I'm trying." The act of writing was like breathing a way to release the pressure building inside me. I didn't show the letters to anyone, but they were mine, a space where I could be honest, unbroken. One evening, as I watered the geranium by the oak tree, I noticed a new shoot pushing through the soil, green and fragile. I knelt my hands in the dirt and felt a surge of pride. I'd planted this, tended it, and it was thriving despite the neglect around it. The oak tree loomed above its branches, whispering in the breeze, and I thought of Tom, of the initials we'd carved there decades ago. I traced them with my finger, L&T, worn but still legible. The tree had seen it all, our love, our struggles, our promises. It saw me now, kneeling in the dusk, refusing to disappear. I began to notice other things too. The way the light slanted through my bedroom window at dawn, painting the floor in gold. The scent of the lavender I'd tucked into my pillow, a habit from my mother. The sound of my own voice reading aloud to myself, steady and clear. These were small, but they were mine pieces of a life I was piecing back together. I wasn't ready to confront David or Karen, not yet. The hurt was too raw, the power imbalance too stark. But I was preparing in my own way, gathering strength, like a river gathering speed before a bend. One afternoon, I found an old photo in a drawer, a picture of me and Tom taken on this very porch, our arms around each other, laughing. I was 30, then my hair dark, my smile wide. I looked at that woman and felt a pang, not of loss, but of recognition. She was still in me, that Lily who'd faced the world with courage, who'd built a home from nothing. I slipped the photo into my notebook, a reminder of who I'd been and who I could be again. As I sat on the porch that evening, the geranium glowing in the fading light, I pulled Karen's note from my pocket. I unfolded it, the paper worn from handling, and studied her handwriting. It was a small thing, but it had loomed so large a symbol of my erasure. I thought of Clara's advice, of Wolf's words, of the geranium's new shoot, and I thought of the deed locked away in the bank, my name inked on its lines. They didn't know, but I did. That knowledge was a quiet power growing stronger each day. I folded the note and tucked it back into my pocket, my gaze drifting to the oak tree. Its roots ran deep like mine, anchoring this house, this life. I wasn't ready to act, not yet, but I was ready to keep moving, to keep claiming space, to keep remembering who I was. And as the stars began to pierce the sky, I felt that spark inside me flare just a little, lighting the way forward. The spark inside me, once faint, began to burn steadier, like a hearth fire kindled after a long winter. It wasn't loud or showy, but it warmed me, giving shape to the days that had blurred into weeks since Ethan's cruel words in the kitchen. I was still Lillian Wilson, still 68, still living in a house where I felt like a stranger, but I was no longer content to fade. The geranium by the oak tree bloomed brighter, its red petals a quiet rebellion against the grayness of my life. My walks to the library, my mornings on the porch, my notebook filled with letters to Tom and myself, they were stitches in a torn fabric mending me back together. But I knew I needed more than small acts to reclaim what was mine. I needed to move, to act, to prove to myself, if no one else, that I was not the burden they'd made me feel. The idea came to me one morning as I sat in the library, a room of one's own, open on the table. Wolf's words about money and space echoed in my mind, mingling with Clara's advice to claim something for myself. I thought about the deed to the house locked away in the bank, a secret David and Karen didn't suspect. They assumed the house was theirs, that I was just a guest they tolerated. But the truth was a weight in my favor, a power I'd never wielded. I'd spent 43 years pouring my life into this home, every mortgage payment, every repair, every memory carved into its walls. It was mine, legally and morally. And that knowledge stirred something new in me, not just defiance, but purpose. I started by visiting the bank. It was a quiet decision made without fanfare. One afternoon when David and Karen were at work and Ethan was at school, I dressed in my best blouse, a soft blue one Tom always loved, and walked to the bus stop. The ride downtown was slow, the bus rattling past familiar streets, but I felt a strange calm, like I was stepping into a version of myself I'd forgotten. At the bank, I asked for my safe deposit box. The clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, led me to the vault and left me alone with the metal box. I opened it, my hand steady, and pulled out the deed. The paper was crisp, the ink bold Lillian Wilson. I traced my name, feeling its weight, its truth. This house, this life was mine. I didn't take the deed home, I wasn't ready for that, but seeing it, holding it, was enough to set my course. Back home, I began to research quietly and methodically. I used the library's computers, learning about property laws, real estate markets, and what it meant to sell a house. I wasn't sure I'd go through with it, not yet, but the act of learning felt like reclaiming a piece of my mind. I'd always been good with numbers, balancing budgets as a school secretary, managing our finances when Tom was sick. That skill hadn't left me even if my family thought I was just an old woman with nothing to offer. I took notes in my notebook, hiding them between my letters to Tom, and each fact I learned, market values, closing costs, capital gains, felt like a brick in a wall I was building around myself. I also started tending to the house in ways I hadn't in years. Not the cleaning or laundry I'd done to keep peace, but real care, the kind that honors a home. I polished the oak banister Tom had installed its grain, gleaming under my touch. I repainted the porch swing, choosing a soft green that reminded me of spring. I weeded the garden beds near the oak tree, planting more geraniums Clara brought me their colors, a quiet claim on the yard. Karen noticed her brow furrowing when she saw the fresh paint or new flowers, but she didn't comment. David didn't notice at all, his eyes always elsewhere. Ethan once muttered something about wasting time, but I ignored him. My hands in the soil, my heart steady. These were my choices, my marks on a house they thought they owned. Clara became my confidant, though I didn't tell her everything. Over tea on the porch, I shared my visits to the library, my rediscovery of my own strength. She listened, her eyes bright, and told me about her own choices, how she'd sold her husband's old car after he died using the money to travel to live. "You don't owe them your life, Lily," she said one day, her voice firm. "You gave them enough. Now give something to yourself." Her words sank deep, and I began to think about what I wanted, not just what I'd lost. A small apartment maybe with a window for morning light, a garden of my own, a life where I wasn't an afterthought. One evening, I found an old watch in a drawer, Tom's watch, its leather band worn, but its face still ticking. I hadn't seen it in years, forgotten in the chaos of David and Karen's arrival. I slipped it onto my wrist, the weight familiar, comforting. It was too big, meant for a man's hand, but it felt right, like Tom was with me, steadying me. I wore it every day, a silent symbol of my resolve. Karen raised an eyebrow when she saw it, but I didn't explain. It was mine, like the house, like my life. I also began to speak up, not loudly, but enough to be heard. When Karen left another note, "Lily, please don't rearrange the pantry," I didn't tuck it away. I walked to the kitchen where she was chopping vegetables and said, "I've been organizing this pantry for 40 years, Karen. I think I know where things go." My voice was calm, but it carried a strength I hadn't used in years. She blinked, startled, and muttered something about just trying to help. I didn't argue, but I didn't back down either. It was a small moment, but it shifted something between us, a crack in the wall she'd built to keep me out. At the library, Sarah noticed the change in me. "You're standing taller, Mrs. Wilson," she said one day, handing me a book on women's history. "Something's different." I smiled, touching Tom's watch on my wrist. "I'm remembering who I am," I said, and she nodded like she understood. I read that book cover to cover stories of women who'd fought for their place, Sojourner Truth. Eleanor Roosevelt, women who'd refused to be silenced. Their courage fed mine, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet choices I made each day. One night I sat by the oak tree, the geraniums glowing in the moonlight. I pulled out my notebook and wrote a letter, not to Tom this time, but to myself. "Dear Lily," I began, "you are not done. You are not invisible. You built this life, and you can build another." The words felt like a promise, one I was starting to believe. I thought about the deed, about selling the house, about what it would mean to walk away. It wasn't about revenge, though the thought of their shock tempted me. It was about dignity, about choosing myself after years of choosing others. I wasn't ready to act, not fully, but I was preparing. I called a real estate agent, a woman Clara recommended, and met her at a coffee shop downtown. She was kind, professional, and didn't treat me like an old woman out of her depth. I told her I was exploring options for my house, not ready to commit. She gave me a market analysis explaining what the house could fetch, more than I'd imagined, enough for a new start. I tucked her card into my notebook, my heart racing with possibility. As I walked home, Tom's watch ticking on my wrist, I felt the oak tree calling me even from a mile away. It had seen me at my weakest, but it saw me now growing stronger step by step. I wasn't the Lily who'd cowered after Ethan's words, nor the Lily who'd let Karen's notes dictate her place. I was something new, something whole, and I was just beginning to understand what that meant. The steady burn of that inner fire grew no longer just a spark, but a flame that warmed me through the chill of my family's indifference. Ethan's mocking words, "Go to your room." Grandma still lingered a bruise that ached when I let my guard down, but they no longer defined me. I was Lillian Wilson, 68 years old, and I was done shrinking to fit the space David, Karen, and Ethan had carved out for me. The house, with its creaky floors and sagging porch, was mine in a way they couldn't fathom, and that truth was a foundation I was building on brick by quiet brick. My visits to the bank, my research at the library, my small acts of defiance, like wearing Tom's watch or planting geraniums, they were steps towards something bigger, a life where I wasn't an afterthought, but the author of my own story. I began to move with intention, each choice a deliberate claim on my dignity. The real estate agent, Susan, became a regular contact. I met her again at the coffee shop this time, bringing a list of questions I'd scribbled in my notebook. What would selling the house involve? How long would it take? Could it be done discreetly? Susan answered patiently, her voice calm but her eyes sharp, sensing the weight of my decision. "You're in the driver's seat, Lily," she said, sliding a folder of comparable sales across the table. "This house is your asset, your choice." Her words echoed Wolf's Clara's, my own letters to myself. Your choice, your space, your life. I left the meeting with a plan forming, not yet solid, but taking shape like a sketch before the paint touches the canvas. At home, I kept up my quiet work. I polished the oak banister until it gleamed, tended the geraniums until they spilled over their beds, and repainted the back door a deep blue, a color Tom had once suggested, but we'd never gotten to. Karen noticed her lips pursing when she saw the fresh paint, but she didn't comment. Ethan, passing by with his earbuds in, muttered, "Why bother?" under his breath. I didn't flinch. "Because it's mine," I said, my voice steady, and he shrugged, walking away. David remained oblivious, lost in his phone or his work, but I didn't need their approval anymore. Each brushstroke, each weeded patch was a declaration this house, this life belonged to me. I started sorting through the house's history, a task I'd avoided for years. In the attic, I found boxes of old photos, letters, and mementos, Tom's fishing lures, David's childhood drawings, my mother's quilt. I spent evenings sifting through them, not with nostalgia, but with purpose. I was cataloging my life, deciding what to keep, what to let go. One night, I found a letter Tom had written me during his last hospital stay, his handwriting shaky but clear. "Lily, you're stronger than you know. Don't let the world dim your light." I pressed the letter to my chest, tears pricking my eyes, and slipped it into my notebook. It felt like a blessing, a reminder of the woman I was becoming again. Clara sensed the shift in me. Over tea on the porch, she tilted her head, studying me. "You're up to something, Lillian," she said, her smile sly. I didn't tell her about the deed or the real estate agent, not yet, but I admitted I was thinking about change. "Good," she said, setting her cup down. "You've given them everything. Now take something for yourself." She told me about a friend who'd sold her home and moved to a seaside cottage, living simply but fully. The image stuck with me, a small place, a garden, a view of the water. Not running away, but starting over. I began to assert myself in new ways. When Karen left another note, "Lily, please don't touch the thermostat," I didn't ignore it. I found her in the living room folding Ethan's laundry and said, "Karen, I've lived here 43 years. I know how to keep this house comfortable." My tone was even, but my eyes held hers, unyielding. She blinked, caught off guard, and mumbled, "Fine, just don't set it too high." It wasn't an apology, but it was a retreat, and I felt the balance shift, just a fraction. I didn't need to yell or fight. My presence, my refusal to shrink was enough. At the library, Sarah became more than a kind face. She started inviting me to a book club that met on Thursdays, a group of women, some my age, some younger, who discussed novels and shared stories of their lives. I hesitated at first, unsure if I belonged, but Sarah insisted. "You have stories, Mrs. Wilson," she said, handing me. "Their eyes were watching God. We'd love to hear them." I went nervous but curious and found myself talking about Janie, about love and loss, about finding your voice. The women listened, nodded, shared their own struggles, divorces and empty nests, dreams deferred. For the first time in years, I felt seen not as a grandmother or a widow, but as Lily, a woman with something to say. The book club gave me courage to reach out further. I called an old colleague, Betty, who'd retired from the school district a few years before me. We met for lunch at a diner, and over grilled cheese sandwiches, I told her about my life, now the neglect, the notes, the deed. Betty, always blunt, slammed her hand on the table. "Lily, you're sitting on a gold mine and they're treating you like dirt. Do something about it." Her outrage was a mirror to my own, and I left the lunch feeling lighter, stronger. Betty promised to connect me with a lawyer she knew just in case, and I tucked that possibility away, another tool in my growing arsenal. One afternoon, I took a bold step. I called Susan, the real estate agent, and asked her to visit the house for an appraisal. I timed it for a day when David and Karen were out Ethan at school. Susan walked through the rooms, her notepad in hand, commenting on the oak banister, the large lot, the potential. "This is a gem, Lily," she said, standing by the oak tree. "You could get a strong price enough to set you up wherever you want." I nodded, my heart pounding. I wasn't committing, not yet, but the appraisal was a concrete step, a line crossed. Susan left me with a folder of numbers and options, and I hid it in the attic behind the boxes of Tom's things. That night, I sat by the oak tree, Tom's watch heavy on my wrist. The geraniums glowed in the dusk, their roots deep in the soil I'd tended. I pulled out my notebook and wrote another letter to myself. "Dear Lily, you are not their servant, not their burden. You are a woman who built a home, a life, and you can build another. Choose yourself." The words felt like a vow, one I was ready to keep. I thought about the appraisal, the number Susan had given me, the possibility of a new start. It wasn't about punishing David or Karen or Ethan, though the thought of their surprise was a quiet satisfaction. It was about honoring the woman Tom had loved, the woman I was rediscovering. I began to dream of what could come next. A small house, maybe with a porch for morning tea, a garden where I could plant whatever I wanted, a life where I answered to no one but myself. The dreams were fragile, but they grew stronger each day, fed by my choices, my courage, my refusal to be erased. The oak tree watched its branches swaying, and I felt Tom's presence in the breeze urging me forward. I wasn't ready to tell David or Karen, not yet. The plan needed time, needed care, like the geraniums I'd nurtured. But I was moving step by quiet step toward a future I could claim. And as I closed my notebook, the stars bright above, I felt that flame inside me burn brighter, lighting a path I was finally ready to walk. The flame within me had grown into a steady glow, no longer flickering, but constant, a beacon, guiding me through the fog of my family's neglect. Ethan's words, "Go to your room." Grandma still echoed in quiet moments, a reminder of how far I'd been pushed, but they no longer held the power to break me. I was Lillian Wilson, 68, and I was reclaiming my life not with loud confrontations, but with deliberate, quiet choices that reshaped the ground beneath me. The house, my house, stood as a testament to 43 years of love and labor, its deed bearing my name alone, a secret that anchored me as I moved toward a future I could scarcely imagine months ago. The geraniums by the oak tree, the books I read. Tom's watch on my wrist, the appraisal hidden in the attic, they were all pieces of a puzzle. I was assembling a picture of a life where I was whole. I began to act with a precision I hadn't known I still possessed. Susan, the real estate agent, became a partner in my quiet revolution. We met regularly, always away from the house, at the coffee shop or the library where I could speak freely. I told her I was ready to move forward not just with an appraisal, but with listing the house. Discreetly, I said, my voice firm, I don't want them to know until it's done. Susan nodded her eyes, understanding. She explained the process, staging showings offers, and promised to handle it with care scheduling viewings when David, Karen, and Ethan were out. "This is your decision, Lily," she said, handing me a contract. "You're in control." I signed it, my hand steady, and felt a weight lift, not of fear, but of hesitation. This was real now, a path I'd chosen. Back home, I prepared in secret. I sorted more of the attic, packing away what I'd take a few photos, Tom's letter, my mother's quilt, and marking what could be sold or donated. The act was both painful and liberating, like pruning a tree to let it grow stronger. I found an old jewelry box one Tom had given me for our 10th anniversary, and inside was a locket I'd forgotten, a simple silver oval with our initials, L&T, engraved on the back. I slipped it around my neck, its cool weight against my chest, a reminder of the love that had built this life and the strength that would carry me into the next. Karen didn't notice the locket, nor did David, but Ethan's eyes lingered on it, once a flicker of curiosity, quickly replaced by indifference. I didn't care. It was mine, like the house, like my future. I continued my small assertions, each one a brick in the wall of my dignity. When Karen left a note, "Lily, please don't use the dishwasher. It's new," I didn't tuck it away. I found her in the kitchen chopping carrots with that sharp efficiency of hers and said, "Karen, I've been running this house longer than you've been alive. I'll use what I need." My voice was calm, but it carried a steel I hadn't used before. She froze her knife, pausing mid-chop, and for a moment I saw uncertainty in her eyes. "Fine," she muttered, turning back to her cutting board. It wasn't a victory in the way the world might measure, but it was mine, a reclaiming of space she'd tried to deny me. The book club at the library became a cornerstone of my new strength. The women there, Mary, who'd survived a bitter divorce, Linda, who'd raised 3 kids alone, Sarah, who listened with quiet wisdom, saw me not as a grandmother or a widow, but as Lily, a woman with stories and worth. We read The Color Purple, and Sally's journey from silence to strength mirrored my own. During one meeting, I shared a piece of my story, not the deed or the sale, but the pain of Ethan's words, David's silence, Karen's notes. The women listened, their faces soft with understanding, and Mary reached for my hand. "You're not alone, Lily," she said, "and you're not done." Their words wrapped around me like a quilt, warm and steady, and I left each meeting taller, my heart fuller. Betty, my old colleague, became another ally. After our lunch, she'd connected me with a lawyer, a woman named Rachel, who specialized in real estate and estate planning. I met Rachel at her office, a small space filled with plants and sunlight. I told her about the house, the deed, my family's assumptions. "I want to sell," I said, "but I need to protect myself." Rachel listened, her pen moving swiftly across a notepad, and outlined my rights, my options, the steps to ensure the sale was clean and binding. She also suggested updating my will, a task I'd avoided since Tom's death. "You decide who inherits your legacy, Lily," she said, "not them." I left her office with a folder of documents and a sense of clarity. The house was mine to sell, the money mine to use, the future mine to shape. I began to imagine that future in vivid detail. A small cottage, perhaps, with a porch for my morning tea and a garden for geraniums. A town where I could walk to a library, join a book club, make friends who saw me as Lily, not Grandma. I researched places online at the library, printing listings for towns along the coast, their names, Rockport, Camden, Beaufort, sounding like promises. I didn't want to run away. I wanted to arrive, to land in a life that was mine. The thought of leaving the oak tree, the house Tom's memory ached, but I knew he'd want this for me. "Don't let the world dim your light," he'd written, and I was determined to shine. Susan began the sale process, and the house saw its first showings. She was careful scheduling them during the day when the family was out. I'd leave for the library or Clara's returning to find Susan's card on the counter, a note saying, "Good showing today." The house polished and tended by my hands was a draw. Its large lot, its sturdy bones, its history. Offers started coming in higher than I'd expected, and Susan walked me through them at the coffee shop. "You've got options, Lily," she said, spreading out the papers. "Take your time." But I was ready. I chose an offer cash, quick closing from a young family looking for a home to grow into. It felt right, like passing the house to someone who'd love it, even if my own family hadn't. I didn't tell David, Karen, or Ethan. Not yet. The sale was my secret, my power, and I held it close like the locket against my chest. But I prepared for the aftermath. I opened a new bank account one they didn't know about and arranged for the sale proceeds to go there. Rachel helped me draft a new will, leaving small bequests to David and Ethan, not out of obligation, but because I still loved them, even if they'd forgotten how to love me. The rest I'd use for my new life. I also started looking at cottages, narrowing my search to a town called Gloucester, where the sea met the sky and the library hosted poetry readings. One evening, I sat by the oak tree, the geraniums vibrant in the twilight. I wore Tom's watch and the locket, their weight grounding me. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Dear Lily, you've carried this house, this family for decades. Now carry yourself. You're ready." The words felt like a blessing, a final push toward the edge I was approaching. The closing date was set, the papers ready. Soon the truth would come out and I'd be free. I looked up at the oak tree, its branches swaying, and whispered, "Thank you, Tom. For the love, for the strength, for the life we'd built." I wasn't leaving him behind. I was carrying him with me into a future I was finally brave enough to claim. The day the truth came out was as ordinary as any other, the kind of day that doesn't warn you it's about to change everything. I woke early as always to the soft creak of the house settling, the faint glow of dawn slipping through my window. I brewed tea with my hidden kettle, sat on the porch with Tom's watch on my wrist and the locket against my chest, and watched the neighborhood stir. The geraniums by the oak tree stood vibrant, their roots deep in the soil. I'd tended, a quiet testament to my resolve. For weeks, I'd moved in secret signing papers with Susan, meeting Rachel to finalize my will, choosing a cottage in Gloucester where I'd start anew. The sale of the house was done closed 2 days ago, the money safely in my new account, the deed transferred to a young family who'd move in soon. David, Karen, and Ethan didn't know, but today they would. The eviction notice prepared by Rachel was ready to be delivered, and I felt a calm I hadn't known in years, like a river finally reaching the sea. I'd planned it carefully. Susan had warned me the buyers wanted possession soon, and Rachel had ensured the notice was legal, giving David and Karen 30 days to vacate. I didn't want a scene, not out of anger or spite, but because my dignity didn't need their noise. I'd spent 43 years building this house, this life, and I'd spent the last months reclaiming it. The notice would speak for me, its words clear and unyielding. This house was mine, always had been, and I'd chosen to let it go. Not for them, but for me. I dressed in my blue blouse, the one Tom loved, and slipped the locket under my collar, its weight a quiet strength. I was ready. The notice arrived at noon, delivered by a courier Rachel had arranged. I was in the living room reading "Their Eyes Were Watching God" when the doorbell rang. Karen answered, her voice sharp as she signed for the envelope. I kept my eyes on the page, my heart steady, though I heard her tear the paper open, her breath catching as she read. "David." She called, her tone rising, and I knew the moment had come. I closed the book, set it on the couch, and stood my hand smoothing my blouse. I didn't need to shout or explain. The truth would do that for me. David came downstairs, Ethan trailing behind, his earbuds dangling. Karen thrust the notice at David, her face pale. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with something between anger and fear. David scanned the paper, his brow furrowing, and then he looked at me. Not with guilt, but with confusion, as if I'd suddenly become a stranger. "Lily, what's going on?" He asked, his tone sharp, like I'd betrayed him. Ethan, leaning against the wall, smirked, but it was uncertain, his eyes flicking to the notice. I met David's gaze, my voice calm but clear. "I sold the house," I said. "It's been mine all along, and I decided it was time to let it go." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy, like stones dropped into still water. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came. David's face reddened, his hands gripping the notice. "Yours," he sputtered. "You never said you let us think." He stopped, as if the truth was too big to fit his words. Ethan's smirk faded, his eyes wide, and for the first time I saw him as the boy he'd been, not the stranger who'd mocked me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. This house was mine and Tom's. I said, my eyes moving from David to Karen to Ethan. We paid for it, loved it, lived it. When you moved in, I welcomed you, but you treated me like I didn't belong, like I was a guest in my own home. I paused, letting the words sink in. Ethan told me to go to my room. You, David, didn't say a word. And Karen, your notes made it clear I was in the way, so I made a choice. I sold the house, and you have 30 days to leave. Karen found her voice shrill and defensive. You can't do this. We've been here paying bills, fixing things. I cut her off, my tone still even. You paid nothing, Karen. The mortgage was paid off years ago by me and Tom. The taxes, the repairs, the utilities, I covered them. You didn't ask, didn't care. You assumed it was yours. I turned to David, my son, the boy I'd raised, and felt a pang, but not enough to waver. I gave you a home, David, and you gave me silence. I'm done being invisible. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm when the world holds its breath. Ethan shifted his eyes on the floor, and I wondered if he remembered the stories I'd told him, the laps he'd sat in. Karen's hands shook, the notice crumpled in David's fist. They didn't argue, didn't plead. They just stared, as if seeing me for the first time, not as Grandma, not as Lily, but as a woman who'd drawn a line they couldn't cross. I walked past them toward the stairs, my steps deliberate. The Byers are a nice family, I said, pausing at the banister I'd polished. They'll love this house like I did. I hope you find a place that's yours. I climbed to my room, my heart pounding but my spine straight, and closed the door. I didn't lock it. I didn't need to. The notice, the sale, my words, they were the lock, the key, the freedom I'd earned. I sat on the bed, the locket warm against my skin, and opened my notebook. I wrote, Dear Lily, you did it. You stood, you spoke, you chose yourself. The words blurred as tears came not of sorrow but of release. I thought of Tom, of the oak tree, of the geraniums I'd leave behind. I thought of Gloucester, the cottage waiting the garden I'd plant. The pain of leaving this house, this life, was real, but so was the peace of knowing I'd honored myself. Downstairs I heard voices, Karen's sharp, David's low, Ethan's silent. They'd process, they'd plan, they'd move on. I didn't hate them, didn't wish them harm. I love them in the way you love what you've lost, but I love myself more now, a love I'd forgotten how to give. Rachel had ensured the sale was airtight, the money mine, the future open. Susan had sent me listings for cottages, and I'd chosen one, a small place with a porch and a view of the sea. I'd move in 2 weeks before the Byers took possession, my belongings already packed in the attic. I stood and walked to the window, gazing at the oak tree. Its branches swayed steady as ever, and I whispered, I did it, Tom. Not for revenge, not for spite, but for me. The locket gleamed in the light. Tom's watch ticked on my wrist, and I felt whole, not because they saw me, but because I saw myself. The house was quiet now, the voices below fading. I didn't know what they'd say tomorrow or if they'd try to fight. It didn't matter. The deed was gone, the sale was done, and I was free. I closed my notebook, slipped it into my bag, and lay down, the stars visible through the window. For the first time in years, I slept without fear, dreaming of a garden by the sea where geraniums would bloom under my hands. The morning I left the house was soft and quiet, the kind of morning that feels like a promise. I woke before dawn, as I always did, and lay still for a moment listening to the familiar creak of the house, settling the faint rustle of the oak tree outside my window. For 43 years, this house had been my world, its walls holding Tom's laughter, David's childhood, my own joys and sorrows. Now it was someone else's sold to a young family who'd fill it with their own stories. The eviction notice had done its work, and David, Karen, and Ethan were preparing to leave their voices hushed and strained in the days since the truth came out. I didn't linger on their reactions. Karen's anger, David's stunned silence, Ethan's averted eyes. I'd said what I needed to say, and I was done carrying their weight. Today I was moving on to a life I'd chosen, to a peace I'd earned. I dressed simply in a cream sweater and slacks, Tom's watch on my wrist, the locket with our initials tucked under my collar. My bags were packed 2 suitcases and a box of keepsakes, all I'd need for the cottage in Gloucester. Clara had offered to drive me, and she'd arrive soon, her old station wagon ready to carry me to the coast. I walked through the house one last time, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood I'd polished the banister I'd tended. The living room, where I'd read my books in quiet defiance, felt lighter now, as if it knew I was free. The kitchen, where Ethan's words had cut me, was just a room, again, its power over me gone. I paused at the back door, looking out at the oak tree and the geraniums, their red petals bright against the morning mist. I'd planted them, nurtured them, and they'd thrive without me, just as I would without this house. I stepped outside, the air cool and sharp, and knelt by the geraniums. My fingers brushed the soil still damp from last night's rain, and I felt a pang, not of loss, but of gratitude. This earth, this tree had held me when I was breaking, had witnessed my return to myself. I stood, my knees aching but my heart steady, and walked to the oak tree. I traced our initials, L&T, worn but eternal, and whispered, "Thank you, Tom, for the love, for the strength, for the life we'd built." I wasn't leaving him behind. I was carrying him with me, in the locket, in the watch, in the woman I'd become. Clara's car pulled up the engine, rumbling softly. She stepped out, her silver hair catching the light, and smiled. "Ready, Lily?" she asked, her voice warm. I nodded, taking one last look at the house, its sagging porch, its weathered siding, its windows reflecting the rising sun. It was beautiful, not because it was mine, but because it had been. I walked to the car, my suitcases already loaded by Clara's nephew, who'd come to help. I didn't look back as we drove away, the oak tree fading in the rearview mirror. I'd said my goodbyes, and I was ready for what came next. The drive to Gloucester was quiet, the radio playing soft jazz, Clara humming along. We talked a little about her latest painting, about the book club I'd joined in my new town. But mostly, we sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from knowing someone sees you. The cottage was waiting, a small place with white clapboard walls, a porch overlooking the sea, and a patch of earth for a garden. I'd seen photos, signed the lease, arranged for my furniture to arrive. The sale money, safely in my account, would cover the rent, the garden tools, the life I'd build. Rachel's work on my will ensured David and Ethan would get something, a small gesture of love, but the rest was mine, a legacy for me. When we arrived, the cottage smelled of salt and pine, its windows open to the breeze. Clara helped me unpack, hanging the sunflower painting she'd given me above the fireplace. We drank tea on the porch, the sea stretching before us, its waves a steady rhythm. "You did it, Lily," Clara said, her eyes bright. "You chose yourself." I smiled, the locket warm against my skin. "I did," I said, and the words felt like a vow kept. The days that followed were gentle, each one a step into my new life. I planted geraniums in the garden, their roots sinking into the coastal soil. I joined the local library, where a librarian named Ellen welcomed me with a stack of novels. I walked the beach each morning, collecting shells, letting the wind carry away the last traces of the woman who'd hidden in her own home. The book club in Gloucester was smaller than the one at home, but the women were kind, their stories weaving with mine over tea and poetry. I wrote in my notebook not letters now, but reflections, dreams, plans. Dear Lily, I wrote one evening you are home. I didn't hear from David or Karen, and I didn't expect to. Ethan sent a text, brief and awkward. Sorry, Grandma. Hope you're okay. I read it. My heart softening but not breaking. I replied, I'm okay, Ethan. Be good. I didn't need their apologies, their approval. I'd forgiven them not for their sake, but for mine to let go of the weight I'd carried too long. I love them in the quiet way you love what's behind you, but I was no longer theirs to define. One afternoon, I walked to the edge of my garden where the geraniums bloomed under the sun. I held a small candle, one I'd bought at a local shop, its wax scented with lavender. I lit it, the flame dancing in the breeze, and set it among the flowers, a symbol of the light I'd found within myself. I thought of Tom, of Clara, of Sarah, and the book club women of the oak tree and the house I'd left. They were all part of me, but this moment, this life was mine alone. I looked out at the sea, its waves endless and free, and felt a peace that settled deep in my bones. I was Lily Ann Wilson, not a grandmother sent to her room, not a widow forgotten, but a woman, whole and alive. And as the candle burned its light mingling with the sunset, I knew the truth that had carried me here. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself.